Barb, thank you so much. And it's really a pleasure and honor to participate in this series of webinars that we have done over the course of the last 2 years. I was saying to Wesley before we began that one of the issues that we at Focus on the Family have tracked for many years in our public policy division is in fact the subject of the webinar today. So many of us spend an enormous amount of our public policy life on the issue of marriage in defense of human life, and of course the overriding issue of religious liberty and rights of conscience, which seem to be in the news and in the headlines and in the public square every day. But one of the issues that all of us care about deeply, that unfortunately does not make it into the headlines or on the newscast every day, is in fact just as important as all of the above, and that is the issue of physician-assisted suicide. And in fact, Wesley, I have to say, living here in Washington, I was reading a story in the Washington Post just yesterday about a brand new effort in Maryland in the right to die physician-assisted area. So this whole topic could not be more timely. It could not be more relevant to the time that we're in. And we decided to come directly to the expert in the country on this whole movement. So as my friend Barb said, you are first among equals at the Great Recovery Institute. We at Focus love working with you as well. And Wesley, we would love to hear from you in behalf of this LCMS webinar on physician-assisted suicide. Where are we at? Where's the country going? What are the areas that all of us should be paying attention to? We really appreciate your time and everything you've done, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thanks to the LCMS for allowing me to present some views. We are really at a very precarious moment in the issue of assisted suicide. I think the point you mentioned, Tim, with regard to the Maryland legislation, there is a blitzkrieg ongoing around the entire country right now to try to legalize assisted suicides beyond the 3 states where it is formally legalized. Currently, it is legal in Oregon, Washington State, and Vermont. There is a very huge push here in California, where I live, that I'm very concerned about. We've been able to push it back twice before, but many of you may know that the California legislature has grown increasingly radical. And in fact, right now in my state, the only adult running things is Governor Jerry Brown. And my only hope here and with regard to what might happen here is that Jerry will remember the time he spent with Mother Teresa and understand that the proper way to help people who are very ill or dying is care and not killing. We also have the disability rights movement, which really is an essential aspect of stopping assisted suicide, particularly in what are sometimes called blue states, because assisted suicide has become perhaps one of the newest liberal talking point, or the liberal political agenda, if you will. So we face a very precarious time. And also Canada's Supreme Court just forced into full national legalization, not only assisted suicide for the terminally ill, but euthanasia for anyone with a medical condition, which can include psychological suffering that causes suffering, and suffering that it doesn't even have to be unable to be ameliorated. It's just that if the person who wants to die doesn't want to ameliorate the suffering, the Supreme Court ruling was incredibly radical, following on the heels of the province of Quebec legalizing euthanasia as well. And I'm going to want to mention what I call medical martyrdom, because the Canadian Supreme Court decision and the Canadian medical associations are right now planning, particularly the medical associations, to force every physician in Canada to either participate in euthanasia if they're asked, as well as abortion, or refer to another doctor they know will do so. And therefore, any doctor in Canada who's pro-life, who may be Catholic or Lutheran or Eastern Orthodox, and who adheres to the sanctity of life ethic, who adheres to Hippocratic medical values, who wants to practice medicine along the Hippocratic Oath, may be forced to choose. And I'm not kidding, may be forced to choose between their faith and their profession. And it's a very serious situation, and you're going to see that happening here too as things move forward. Right now in this country, doctors are not forced to participate, but if you look at the statements and the opinions of many of the board certification groups, physicians groups, they want that as well. And that's because the entire concept of medicine has changed to one of facilitating patient desires. It's called patient rights, as opposed to being a healing profession. And there are two other points I want to make, and we can get into some specific questions. First off, and I don't think I'm certainly alone in this, it's becoming increasingly hard to have a debate around these issues, because a debate presumes a common frame of reference, a common morality, common goals. And then often we have a common goal, a common frame of reference, but very different opinions on the best means to achieve those goals. We don't have that anymore. We have a society that is rendered by, torn by, completely different value systems. And I'm not telling anyone listening to this or watching this webinar anything they don't already know. And that makes it very difficult to have a debate. So I think all you can do today is hold up two different worldviews and show, because most people don't think about worldviews or principles or what do I believe that deeply. They just go on about their lives, raise their kids, take the kids to soccer, maybe watch a game on the weekend and so forth. But these worldviews have consequences, and it's going to have consequences in the lives of everyone. And all I think we can do now is show up the worldviews that we believe in, what the benefits are, what the detriments are, what the consequences will be for following whatever worldview is under discussion, and hope that they pick right. The second thing I want to point out, and I want to discuss during my brief presentation, is how society has changed. You know, for many years, I've been fighting assisted suicide since 1993. And I've always asked myself, why now? Why now, when we can ameliorate suffering? Are we talking about euthanasia, assisted suicide, death with dignity, as if dying naturally isn't dignified? I mean, when my father died naturally of cancer, was he a chump for not killing himself? That's the implication, a very strong implication of the language that is used, and how the media immediately picks up the advocacy verbiage and advocacy phrases of the pro-euthanasia types. Aid in dying is an example. Why now, when we can actually care for people who have very serious conditions and relieve their suffering and keep people from dying in unbearable agony, are we talking about euthanasia when 100 years ago, if you did have a burst appendix or you did get bone cancer, you did die in agony, and people weren't talking about that at all? And I think it's because the purpose of society has changed. And I didn't quite understand it until I read a book by Yuval Levin. Some of you may have heard of Yuval Levin. He's a protege of the great bioethicist Leon Kass. And Leon Kass was the head of the President's Council on Bioethics under President George W. Bush. And Yuval Levin wrote a book called Imagining the Future, which is about the stem cell issue, which we're not going to talk about today. But he had a small portion in that book that made it all come clear to me, and I'd like to share a little bit of that with you. He talked about Descartes, and he said Descartes was awfully bold in describing health as, quote, without doubt the primary good and the foundation of all other goods of this life, close quote. And then Yuval Levin went on to say, surely the claim that health is the primary good has consequences well beyond the agenda of the scientists. Any society's understanding of the foundational good necessarily gives shape to its politics, its social institutions, and its sense of moral purpose and direction. How you live has to do with what you strive for. This is very important. And health is an unusual candidate for the primary good. It is surely an essential good. Without health, not much else can be enjoyed. But Descartes' formulation in the worldview of modern science sees health not only as a foundation, but also a principal goal. Not only as a beginning, but also an end. Relief and preservation from disease and pain, from misery and necessity, become the defining ends of human action and therefore of human society. In other words, what has happened in, say, the last 20 or 30 years is we've gone from a society whose primary goal, which has as its primary goal the protection of the lives of all of its citizens, of promoting righteousness and proper behavior, of adhering to principles in terms of limited government and the philosophy of the United States, the philosophy of Western civilization, the unique dignity of each and every human life. We've gone from that to eliminating suffering as the primary purpose of society. And if the purpose of society is eliminating suffering, that very quickly metastasizes into eliminating the sufferer. And that's what you're seeing today. And it's highly emotional. It's not based on reason. It's not based on a rational analysis. It's based, as you saw with the Brittany Maynard case, it's a stampede of emotion. And the problem also with the idea of eliminating suffering, metastasizing into eliminating the sufferer, is that the concept of suffering itself becomes very elastic. And so, just as an example from my own family, my uncle died of Alzheimer's disease. And of course, my uncle suffered during that process. But so did his wife, my aunt. In fact, she was so distraught the first day that my uncle was in the Alzheimer's unit that she was running to see him, and she was elderly, and she fell down some stairs and broke her hip. My cousin, their daughter, suffered. My mother definitely suffered. My uncle was my mother's rock. Her father had died when she was 5. Her older brother, my uncle Bruno, had been the one stability in her entire life for as long as she could remember. And watching him go through that experience was very difficult on my mother. And I suffered watching this entire situation as well, of course. But also, so did the medical team that cared for my uncle. It's very difficult to care for people, adult, elderly people who are in that circumstance. And I would go visit my uncle and see the other patients and how hard that was. And some even say society suffered by the cost of care for these people. And if you take a look at now around the assisted suicide and euthanasia stories, all of these issues of suffering come into play. For example, Brittany Maynard. She wrote, she didn't try hospice. She rejected hospice out of hand. She assumed the worst case scenario for her circumstance. And when Dr. Ira Byock said that, listen, I've treated people with brain cancer, and we've made sure they didn't go through the kind of extreme difficulties that she was worrying about, she got angry and said, how dare he discuss my medical condition? It was there was a damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of situation. But she not only rejected hospice out of hand because she worried she accepted a worst case potential for her future, but she also said on more than one occasion that she wanted assisted suicide because she didn't want her family to see her go through decline of a terminal illness. In other words, she wrote more than once that she put herself out of her family's misery. This is a very frightening circumstance and a very alarming trend, that because suffering isn't just whether the patient's suffering can be controlled, but the family suffering of going through that very difficult circumstance of watching a loved one go through a final illness and die. Well, if my wife came to me, God forbid she had such an illness, and said, I want assisted suicide so you don't have to watch me go through this, I'd say, how dare you try to make me violate my marriage vows? I promise to stay with you for better or for worse in sickness and in health. But as a society, because we've become so emotional driven, and because preventing suffering has become so overriding, a lot of people are now in these assisted suicide cases. You see it in the Brittany Maynard case. You see it in cases of people who are flying to Switzerland to the suicide clinics. You see it in the Netherlands and in Belgium, where the families are actually supporting the suicides of their loved ones who become ill. In Belgium, just as an example, they're now doing joint euthanasia killings of elderly couples who do not want to be widowed with family support. So we're in a crisis in this culture in Western civilization, and the assisted suicide and euthanasia movement, I think, is just one symptom of that crisis. So I'm going to, I can get into specifics, how in the Netherlands they're now euthanizing people with mental illnesses. Psychiatrists are euthanizing people with mental illnesses and calling it a liberation for the patient and the psychiatrist. That gets into the idea that the suffering of the psychiatrist is being alleviated as well as that of the patient. You also are seeing in the Netherlands and in Belgium, something I warned about in my first anti-euthanasia article, which was published in Newsweek in 1993. It's called The Whispers of Strangers. If people want to look it up on Google, type in Wesley J. Smith, The Whispers of Strangers. I warned that way back then that we have to be very careful because we could start seeing youth organ harvesting promoted as a plumb to society to go along with euthanasia and assisted suicide. And that is now actively happening in the Netherlands and happening in Belgium. In fact, Belgian doctors hold seminars saying the best patients to tie euthanasia and organ transplant medicine with are people with neuromuscular disabilities such as multiple sclerosis or the mentally ill. I even saw one article published in a reputable transplant journal of 4 patients who were killed in euthanasia and then their organs were transplanted into other people. 3 of those patients had disabilities and 1 was mentally ill. And here's the bitter irony, that mental illness was self-harming. So the answer for self-harming was to kill the patient and harvest his organs. I can't think of anything more frightening for weak and vulnerable people than to let people who are barely clinging to life with a mental illness or a disability and despair, let them think that their deaths have greater value than their lives. Well, I can think of one, and that would be a society thinks that as well. And that's why, even though we're not talking about issues like Terri Schiavo, you now see a lot of advocacy in bioethics journals, medical journals, for killing people like Terri Schiavo for their organs, as opposed to taking away their food and water. Finally, as I mentioned, medical martyrdom is going to be a very real issue, not just for doctors, but nurses and others. I'm afraid that unless we're able to hold back this tide, and we are at a crisis point right now, in 10 years, if you are a believer in the Hippocratic Oath, if you are a believer in pro-life, sanctity of human life, equality of human life, if you do not want to be a killer, and you may not be able to be in medicine, there is a real drive to, and I think anecdotally, and maybe some of the watchers and listeners might even have heard of this. I've heard anecdotally now of in medical schools and nursing schools, there's kind of this informal blackballing going on where Christian, very overt Christian and religious and pro-life types are not being allowed into the schools because they're not wanted. That kind of dissent is not welcomed. So I'll stop here and be glad to talk about any specifics and any questions you might have. I can't hear you, Tim. Tim, I think you're muted because I can't hear you.
Wesley, this is Barb.
I hear you, Barb.
Good morning. While Tim is working on his audio, let me just jump in and ask a clarifying question, and maybe you can help all of us understand. Oftentimes when this issue is discussed among circles, it appears to me that I get a sort of a look of disbelief from people thinking that, goodness gracious, this couldn't possibly be happening here in the United States. How do we help people understand that what we're talking about are real threats for our future, for the future of families, for the future of individuals, and as you mentioned, the future of caregivers who are.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Now, I call that the "it can't happen here" syndrome, and it is one of the reasons that it becomes very difficult to work against this, because it's so contrary to everything most people grew up believing in, and particularly who would attend this webinar and caring about and knowing. And the only way to overcome that is to have at your fingertips actual facts, like a few that I mentioned, and then say that this isn't slippery slope argument, alarmism, projecting. These are facts on the ground. These are things that are actually happening. With regard to that money issue, just as one example, in Oregon, assisted suicide is legal, as you know, and they also ration health care for people on Medicaid, that is the insurance for the poor. And so they have these lines so that if, depending on the budget, they've got like 750 different treatments that people might receive. Depending on the budget, maybe one year they'll cover 600 of those, and if you're beneath that, it won't be covered. Maybe the next year it's 550, maybe the next year it's 675, whatever it might be in terms of the budget that they have. Well, Oregon has made it that assisted suicide is never rationed, ever. They've taken it completely off that list, saying we want this available to anyone and everyone who legally can access it, who wants it. And secondly, they have refused life-extending medical treatment for cancer patients. I'm not talking about curative, but sometimes when you have terminal cancer, part of the, and my dad had this when he was dying, you get a last shot of chemo and it gives you an extra 9 months or a year of life, 6 months. And that's a normal and, of course, respected part of cancer care, to extend life even if you can't cure the cancer. Well, you had two people, Barbara Wagner and Randy Stroops, back in 2008. Barbara Wagner had lung cancer. Randy Stroops had terminal prostate cancer. Their doctors prescribed this life-extending chemotherapy. They both received letters, a little too candid, because the administrator said, we're not going to pay for your chemotherapy, but we are going to pay for your assisted suicide, so don't worry about it, right? And they were just appalled and aghast. As Barbara Wagner said, the state will not pay for me to live, but it will pay for me to die. And that gets into that issue of suffering again. You tell people that and they don't believe it, but it's true. And the other thing that you then get after people are in the it can't happen here mode, which it can and is happening now, is the, well, all right, whatever, because there's so many different issues, not just this one, but as you know, all across the board. Just leave me alone. Do whatever you want, leave me alone. The problem with that is they're not going to leave you alone. They are going to, as I mentioned in the medical martyrdom concept, they're going to force at least medical professionals into participating either actively or through referral, meaning being complicit in this kind of behavior. And as we move forward in terms of cost cutting in healthcare and so forth, you're going to find, I believe, increasing push for assisted suicide to be the norm as opposed to the exception. Now, that isn't happening now, but it is something that I think we need to be careful of. And when you start having family members supporting suicides of loved ones, you've entered a cultural crisis where rather than love people to the end of their lives, there is a form of emotional abandonment taking place and a loss of something that is quite essential to a moral and decent society. I still can't hear you, Tim.
Right. Tim will work on the audio still. One of our questions today came from Charlene, and she's actually looks like in Ontario, Canada. So welcome, our Canadian. But her question is related to the organ tissue donor aspect of all of this, and wondering if there might be legislation or policies that would be put in place that life support would have to be withdrawn in order to harvest organs, so that that would be assisted suicide wouldn't necessarily be the main focus there, but in this situation it would be engaging more in speeding the death of one just for the benefit of the organs.
Well, there's two ways, and I don't know the laws of Canada in that regard, but there are two general ways in which organs are able to be harvested. And the patient, we're talking about vital organs because people can, for example, give a kidney, one kidney. We're talking about vital organs. The dead donor rule still exists, meaning the patient has to be dead before the organ can be taken. And there are two ways this is done. One is known as brain death, and that is actually is kind of a misnomer because it assumes that every cell in the brain is gone. But that is not true. Brain death, at least in the United States, and I think it's true in Canada, means an entire failure of the entire brain in all of its constituent parts, so that the brain is not working as a brain in any fashion from brainstem to the cerebellum and so forth. Under those conditions, their bodies can be maintained for a period of time, and that is sometimes called a heart-beating donor because the body is being maintained, because if you stop the ovation and so forth, as there would be no ability to breathe because there would be no stimulus from the brain to cause a breath to be taken, the body would immediately shut down. The second is called a non-heart beating donor protocol, where if somebody is going to have a planned removal of life support, which happens as a regular part of care in hospitals, and people have the right to refuse unwanted medical treatment. We're not vitalists. Then if they want to be a donor, what happens is one set of doctors is supposed to treat the patient as a patient, and if that decision has been made independently, and then there's going to be a donation, the life support is removed. If the patient goes into cardiac arrest, a period of time elapses, usually like 3 to 5 minutes, sometimes as low as 2 minutes, and then the patient is declared dead, and then the procedure can begin. If the patient doesn't go into cardiac arrest, what's supposed to happen is the patient is supposed to be brought back to the room for whatever future care is to be received, and the organ procurement is supposed to not take place. There's some real concerns with those issues, but beyond that, there's even concern now that people are moving towards what's called the presumed consent for organ donation. Right now, you have an opt-in system, meaning, like for me, I have on my license, if I'm dead and I told my wife I need to be dead, then I'm an organ donor. But there's a lot of people, in order to overcome this organ shortage, they want to presume consent, kind of like organ conscription, so that if you have not opted out specifically, you are presumed to be an organ donor. And I worry that is actually done in Spain and some other places, and it has increased the source of organs. But I worry that will affect the way people are treated as patients, and that very ill and very disabled patients can come to be looked upon as organ farms instead of living equals deserving of optimal care. So these are very important issues that we need to consider. And for the listener in Ontario, the Ontario Medical Association, they're called the surgeons, I don't have the exact name, but of doctors and surgeons, the College of Doctors and Surgeons, has just issued an ethical opinion saying that every doctor has to participate in abortion and then presumably euthanasia once that goes into effect, that Supreme Court ruling, or refer to a doctor they know will, at the risk of severe discipline. So medical martyrdom has already come to Ontario, Canada, and it's going to be a very big issue down the line because, as I understand the Charter of Rights, there's supposed to be religious freedom in Canada, but as the society has become more increasingly secular, the idea of religious freedom is taking a back seat, which means that these people who claim to be civil libertarians aren't. because you're not a civil libertarian if you don't hold up for rights of people in which you don't have a personal stake. And with Canada becoming very secularized and the United States and Western Europe, the idea that people should be able to act on their religion in their lives is under attack, and they're trying to push the idea of freedom of religion into a mere freedom of worship, meaning you can decide what you believe the Eucharist is, you can pray as you want in your churches, but you have to live your lives according to secular values, and that's a very real danger to world freedom.
Another one of our listeners has asked specifically about trying to support these topics. As I mentioned before, a lot of people just don't seem to understand the implications for us. Recently, in the last few months, of course, there was the Brittany Maynard story, and we here at the LCMS were very tied into that because of our friend and colleague, Maggie Carner, who spoke out about that issue.
I've met Maggie.
Okay, great. We are very grateful for her participation and her willingness at a very difficult time for herself to speak out with the press, and she went on CNN. A lot of our people, though, can't do that kind of public speaking. How can us Christians, members of the church and the community who care about these issues, how do we deal with the media and support these topics? It seems a little bit out of our reach sometimes.
This is a very difficult circumstance because you'll notice that Brittany Maynard became an international sensation, and that wasn't by accident. You know, there have been more than 700 organ-assisted suicides, and not one of them got this kind of attention. And it got this kind of attention because the euthanasia people are always looking for the right image to present, the right words to use. And Brittany Maynard became perfect because she was young and she was beautiful. It was a tragic circumstance, and she was willing to be exploited by them for their own purposes to try to push this through pure emotional bludgeoning into effect. And so she became a cover story on People magazine. Why? Because she killed herself. It's an astonishing thing. And Maggie got a little bit of attention, but you'll notice that it didn't resonate. You'll notice that her story didn't resonate, you know. And I think that has to do with this concept of suffering, and it also has to do with what I call the I want paradigm. That is, the flip side of the purpose of society is to prevent suffering. The flip side of that is to make sure people get whatever they want. And so nobody has a right to judge anything. And so the answer to Maggie is, well, if you don't want assisted suicide, you don't have it, but you shouldn't be able to stop Brittany Maynard from getting it. And also the idea that a Christian witness is immediately dismissed as Christian. So I think it's important in terms of fighting this agenda that has to become, and wherever we've been successful over the last 20 years, it's because of a very diverse coalition that has come together, which has disagreements on other issues. Some of the most important opponents of euthanasia and assisted suicide have been the disability rights community. And they are able to come forward in a very, in kind of an in-your-face way that if a Christian did it would be looked upon as hateful. But, you know, you can't judge a disability rights advocate in that same way. And they've been able to be in your face and say, listen, you're targeting us. Because this isn't about terminal illness. Understand, this issue of terminal illness is just a foot in the door, because the premise of euthanasia-assisted suicide is that killing is an acceptable answer to human suffering. And with the rare exception of Oregon and Washington and Vermont, terminal illness has nothing to do with any of this. The Canadian Supreme Court did not limit the euthanasia mandate across Canada to the terminally ill. It just has to be a diagnosed medical condition, and it can be psychological suffering. It's not terminally ill in Switzerland where they have suicide clinics. Jack Kevorkian is a country. It's not terminally ill in Belgium or the Netherlands. And once you accept the premise here, it won't be terminally ill either. Because you even have these suicide facilitators who act outside the law. I think they're called Final Exit Network. They don't limit it to terminally ill people, and there's very little that is ever done about it. We are abandoning our suffering. We are abandoning them to death. And how we overcome that is through an understanding that we're in an anti-Christian culture now, and that the people who need to be, I think, most forward in terms of fighting these agendas should be people like the disability rights activists, particularly in liberal states. Because, you know, good communication comes from where the audience is. And disability rights activists have a real good capacity to speak to liberal values, politically liberal values. Bringing an argument that is specifically Christian only will work for specifically Christian people these days, because the society doesn't accept those values anymore. And so we have to, I think, those who are Christian have to understand in terms of public policy advocacy that we have to be as wise as serpents and innocent as doves, and understand that there can be one approach to helping people who are within the church, who are within the fold, and then in terms of the broader public policy fight, be part of coalitions. But I don't think that specifically Christian spokespeople, for example, here in California, shouldn't be the ones who are out fighting the assisted suicide agenda, because it doesn't help, it hurts, based on the value system of the society, not to mention the media bias. I think the media is about to do with assisted suicide what it did to the same-sex marriage issue, that is, begin to presume there's only one legitimate argument to be made. And I'm noticing that the anti-assisted suicide people are pretty well already marginalized in fighting assisted suicide, and often don't even get a voice in stories about this. So, a difficult issue. And I feel sometimes like I'm in the Alamo, hoping that Sam Houston is raising an army, and I don't even know if there is a Sam Houston. But one final point, the longer we hold this at bay, the more lives are being saved. So the fact that it's a difficult time at the moment, you might even say it's Dunkirk at the moment, doesn't mean there won't be a D-Day, but it also means you have to fight and work just as hard, because every day you hold this death agenda at bay, you're saving lives. And that's all we can do.
Thank you. That's actually very hopeful in this very difficult time. One of the pieces that I'm interested in always is history, and one of our listeners pointed out that some of these same issues have existed back in Jesus's time, specifically delineating in the Greco-Roman era, the first 4 centuries following Jesus' ascension. Some of these very same things were faced in our world. And I'm just curious if there's previous eras in the world or periods of time where this issue was faced. Specifically, what comes to mind, and I don't know that it's exactly the same, but the Holocaust comes to mind when life was devalued so completely. I'm wondering if there's anything to learn from times in the previous history that we can use now.
Yeah, I think history is always important to know. Of course, back in the pagan cultures in Rome, there was assisted suicide often, and this was generally, the elites, and often because of political problems. But one of the reasons the Christians rose to such prominence is they lived the love of their faith. And so when babies were exposed on hills, which was a common practice back then, Christians would save these children and raise them. Christians would be the ones taking care of people who were ill, and taking care of the widows and the elderly. And people saw of that time the love that Christians expressed for both within their community and for those who were not yet in their community. And it had a big, along with the martyrdom, those things really built the faith, obviously. I'm very careful in terms of the Holocaust, because if you say, oh, this is Nazis, that'll bounce right off people's heads, because they'll look at people who advocate for assisted suicide or Brittany Maynard and say, it's true, they're not Nazis. Well, they're not. But it wasn't the Nazis. It was eugenics. And what did eugenics say? Eugenics said that all human beings are not equal. Eugenics denied what I call human exceptionalism, the unique dignity of each and every human life. And what happens when you do that? That was also the basis for slavery. When you say that there are some people who have greater value than other people, which is the intrinsic heart and soul of euthanasia, it says some people's lives are worth protecting from suicide and some are worth facilitating. Well, that's a creation of profound inequality. So you saw what happened in the Holocaust was first you had infanticide of babies, and people should read The Nazi Doctors by Robert J. Lifton. This was not the Nazis forcing doctors to kill babies. This was doctors embracing the agenda of killing babies born with disabilities as a healing treatment for the baby. So it was this idea of we're going to prevent suffering of the baby. And at first, Jews weren't even permitted to have this because it was believed, again, to be benefits to the babies, a healing for the family, and a healing for the Reich. That is why these disabled babies were being killed. And then that transferred into the T4 program, which brought Tiergarten 4, which was the address of the Chancellor's office, Hitler's office, and that ended up killing as a prelude or a rehearsal for the Holocaust, disabled adults and so forth. They developed the gas and that kind of thing. But you had doctors killing disabled infants even after the end of the fighting until some of these hospitals were liberated. And it's because doctors thought they were doing the right thing. It was a eugenic belief system. It was a utilitarianism that said human lives do not have equal value based on a quality of life ethic, which you now see coming again in bioethics, a quality of life ethic. And in the Netherlands, by the way, they are killing babies again, born with disabilities or terminal conditions. There have been studies in the Lancet. 8% of all infants who die in the Netherlands are killed by doctors. Not 8% of all infants, but 8% of all infants who die. There's something in your watchers can watch, viewers, called the Groningen Protocol, Groningen. It is a bureaucratic checklist for killing babies and based on illness or disability, based on quality of life. And it's technically murder in the Netherlands, but it's so well allowed still that this was published in medical journals. And to show you how well respected this is around the world, it was published in the New England Journal of Medicine without criticism. So this is a very serious problem. In Belgium, they have done away with all age limits for assisted suicide. That's because they believe that ending suffering is the most important purpose of society, and killing is an acceptable answer to accomplish that goal. Once you accept the premise, there's Katie bar the door. There's no breaks eventually, because human beings are a logical species. We'll take things where they lead us. So we can learn from history, but I don't think it is a good idea to say, well, this is the Nazis. You let other people say, but wait a minute, didn't Nazi doctors do that? And then you could say, oh, yeah, you're right. Let people come to that conclusion themselves, because if you push that meme, it'll bounce off people's heads, because it's been said too often, and it's often been said in inappropriate places and for inappropriate agenda items. But there is a return to those kinds of values. It isn't the racial hygiene issue of the Nazis. It is the eugenics issue, that there's a rejection of the sanctity and equality of life, and in place embracing a quality of life ethic where some people have greater value than others. And once you accept that premise, those who are deemed to have lesser value always get it in the neck.
Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. I've heard that discussion or heard that question before, and so I'm grateful for your explanation and expanding on that topic. Before the webinar ends, I just want to ask you to highlight once again where we're at across the United States in terms of laws that legalize assisted suicide and any upcoming legislation that you're aware of we should watch for?
Sure. 3 states have legal assisted suicide: Oregon, Washington, and Vermont. 2 states, it's questionable. In Montana, there was a Supreme Court ruling, very muddled, saying that it may not be against public policy, but this was done under the kind of advanced directive statute, so that's very unclear whether that's legal or not legal. In New Mexico, a trial judge ruled that there's a constitutional right in the state constitution to assisted suicide. That's on appeal, so apparently it's only in effect in 1 county. The United States Supreme Court, by the way, in 1997 ruled 9-0 that there is not a constitutional right to assisted suicide. So having a assisted suicide Roe v. Wade is going to be very difficult because that was a 9-0 decision. I don't know whether that same kind of unanimity would hold today. I think they made a tactical error in trying to get that Supreme Court ruling that early in the debate. But it is what it is, so it's going to be much harder for them to get a nationwide imposition by court fiat. I think almost every state in this union is going to see attempts to legalize assisted suicide in the next year or two. Some will be more serious than others because what they're constantly doing is softening the ground. They're like the Energizer Bunny. This is their religion. They never stop, and they are very, very well funded. George Soros has this as one of his prime agenda items, and Compassion and Choices, which used to be known as the Hemlock Society, gets millions of dollars every year to push this. And that's why the Brittany Maynard thing, you saw that was an incredibly sophisticated public relations international agenda item. And then, of course, they all work together. So the fact of the Canada Supreme Court ruling will impact us down here in the 48 states and in Alaska, obviously, because a lot of people look to Canada as a very reasoned and rational, wonderful country. I love Canada. And when Canada says it's okay, that's going to impact people's value system here. There's a very serious attempt to legalize here in California that I'm most worried about. And of course, if California legalizes, that becomes easier across the country. You're going to see, particularly in what are known as blue states, efforts, Maryland, Connecticut, New York, to legalize, but you're also seeing it in some red states. Even Utah has a bill pending, although I don't think that will pass. Hawaii. So everybody in every state is going to have to be on guard for these kinds of items. And I think that this will, once the same-sex marriage thing has been fully resolved, I think that this is going to become, perhaps I'm wrong, but the next major media push in terms of trying to get a radical social change that they believe is compassion and, quote, choice. But it really is abandoning, and it is a rejection of everything that we're supposed to do as human beings, care for each other to the end. I was able to interview Dame Cecily Saunders, who was the founder of the modern hospice movement, one of the great humanitarians, medical humanitarians of the 20th century. She's the suffering that her work alleviated can't even be quantified. And she was dead set against legalizing assisted suicide because she said it denied the intrinsic dignity of her patients. In fact, the way hospice has always been, a major element of hospice has been suicide prevention. And that is now being dropped aside. I'm finding that the hospice movement generally, the professional organizations, they're not even fighting this agenda anymore. They're just keeping quiet about it. Well, that to me is a surrender. And there are some hospice people who have been infected by hemlock attitudes that actually support assisted suicide. But if you have assisted suicide in hospice and you've denied the patient who kills themselves suicide prevention, it's like saying you denied them pain control and thinking you've done a good job. You have denied them one essential part of how hospice was conceived, to help people get through those dark moments And I've met people who, even though they were terminally ill, were very happy and suicidal, were very happy that they actually didn't do it and lived on to experience the rest of their lives. But that takes time and effort. And then there's the money issue. It can take about $1,000 for an assisted suicide, including the doctor's visit and the poison. It might cost $100,000 to help people overcome that desire so they want to continue to live. The force of gravity in today's day and age and the pressing problems of healthcare financing are obvious. So we're up against a cultural crisis, meeting the same time this financial healthcare crisis, and a belief that human life does not have intrinsic value. It leads to some very difficult times. But as I said, we were called to times such as this, and we should not allow ourselves to be discouraged, but should stand strong as an example of what it means to care for people. And lives are saved every day by that. And I think we also have to create a milieu in which caregiving is valued, and that the person receiving care has an obligation too, and that is to receive care graciously and to make it easy for the caregivers to the best of their ability, so that it becomes a team effort. And caring for the caregivers is a crucial aspect of this whole issue that I think gets too little attention.
Very good. One of my final questions might be to summarize for us what our strategy should be going forward. You mentioned that this just might be the next big thing for our country to wrestle with, and quite honestly, I agree with you wholeheartedly on that, and that's one of the reasons we wanted you to join us today on this webinar. But as we go forward, we're wrestling with being Christians, believing in Christ, the crucified, the resurrected King, and as Christians, we desire to proclaim that. On the same hand, we're dealing with, as you said, a culture that doesn't have those same values or beliefs. What is then the best strategy for us going forward, fighting this issue in the public square? How do we balance those?
Well, it seems to me that fighting this issue in the public square is not a matter of proselytizing the faith. It is in a democratic society standing up for proper public policies that are consistent with a equality of life or sanctity of life value. Sometimes to say to Christians, well, don't speak Christian is difficult, because it's like saying that they shouldn't be who they are. But if we want to save lives and if we want to maintain good, decent laws, you have to do it in a way that is, first, of course, ethical, but second, that is effective. And I think that there are a lot of different fronts that need to be taken. Within the church, by the way, there's a lot of wobbliness. And I think that upholding within the church, where, of course, talking about Christian values is not only appropriate, it's necessary, it's essential, it is the purpose of clergy and of church workers. I think people within the church themselves have to be upheld and uplifted and fortified, because, you know, the secular culture, the decadence that we see around us, the hedonism we see around us, that sits through the keyholes, that sits under the door sills. And it's like being a fish in water. It's part of the milieu in which we all swim and live and breathe. And we cannot assume that just because somebody is a Christian that they understand that assisted suicide is wrong. In fact, you see a lot of Christian movement in that direction. And so I think the LCMS, I was able and honored to work several years ago with Tim and others to help fashion the LCMS's assisted suicide policy. I didn't do anything with regard to the theology, but I did do it with regard to the public policy issue, and I coordinated with them. And I think pastors need to start bringing this up. I think pastors need a real education, because a lot of times people will go into the pastor's study and say, listen, you know, my grandma's at the hospital and they're saying don't give her a feeding tube because she'll never be able to walk again. And the pastor will think, oh, that can't be right. Yes, it can be right. So I think that there's a lot of clergy who are not even aware that this stuff is going on. I think there are a lot of clergy who are also afraid to bring it up because they're afraid of being divisive. They don't want to lose people in their I don't know about LCMS, but in other faiths, and not faiths, but what's the term I'm looking for? Denominations. This is a 65-year-old mind here. Denominations. There are a lot of people who won't bring things up, pastors and priests, because they don't want to offend people in the pews. Well, that's because people in the pews are beginning to accept these secular, hedonistic, and decadent value systems, and are beginning to say, well, why? You even hear from the most devout Christians, well, if I put down my kitty because my kitty's sick, why can't I put down grandma? Well, grandma's a human being, not a cat. Human beings are different than people. I asked my mother that question when I was 8, and she said, well, a human being is not the same thing as an animal. That very understanding is being lost not only in the secular society, but in the pews and in the churches. And then you have to understand that with regard to animals, we don't just put them down because they're terminally ill. People put their pets down because they're incontinent and they're beginning to mess the couch. They put them down because they don't want to spend the money it might take to care for that animal, which isn't understandable. It's not putting down that aspect, but we treat animals differently than people. I was just, in my work on human exceptionalism, I've been gotten into the radical animal rights agenda where people say in animal rights, and this is different from animal welfare. A rat is a pig is a dog is a boy. What they mean, that's a quote from Ingrid Newkirk of People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. They mean that humans and animals are equal. That is the ideology of animal rights, as again, opposed to animal welfare. There was a dog just killed terribly in England, a show dog poisoned, and I saw a lot of stories talking about that dog being murdered. A dog can't be murdered. Only a human being can be murdered. That's an important distinction. But even in our language now, we are losing those distinctions. And I think people need to be educated about these things. My blog on National Review, it's called the Human Exceptionalism blog, nationalreview.com. I talk about these issues every day, and I try to connect dots with not only assisted suicide, but how human exceptionalism, the intrinsic dignity and the duties we have are impacted. Patients' Rights Council, that's patientsrightscouncil.org, and I consult with them. They have, I think, the most complete online library to help educate people about these issues. Patientsrightscouncil.org. That's an organization run by Rita Marker. I know nobody who knows more about these issues than Rita Marker. She's the one who kind of dragged me kicking and screaming into this more than 20 years ago. So understand that the culture isn't what you think it is. Do not fall for the "it can't happen here" complacency, and educate yourself. And be willing to defend the value of people who are having difficulties. How often have all of us been walking down the street and maybe we see somebody in a difficult wheelchair situation across the street and say, gee, if I were like that, I'd go to Kevorkian. That's a real opportunity to say, hey, nobody's Kevorkian bait. Everybody's life has value. Our job is not to end people's lives. It's to care for them and love them. And in fact, people who are in extremists have a greater claim on our love and capacity for compassion, which means to suffer with, than perhaps other people. So it's very important to act as Christians, not just acting as a Christian, loving somebody without even discussing it has the most powerful impact of all. We lead by example. And so people can live a Christian life without necessarily saying you have to find Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior in that particular circumstance, and have a tremendous amount of good, not only in public policy, but perhaps eventually leading people to a better understanding of ultimate reality.
Very good. Thank you. I see Tim is back. I'm not sure, Tim, if your audio is up. It doesn't look like it is.
Hold up a sign.
You can hold up a sign and say hello. We've enjoyed, we've enjoyed, Wesley, having you here today. Thank you so much for sharing all of this information and giving us some guidance on how to handle this in our own lives, in our own church and community. We will continue to work on this issue and continue to witness to Christ where it's appropriate on these issues so that we can be a strong voice in the public square.
That's right. Be discerning when that is appropriate and when perhaps we should just talk about the public policy ramifications, which are manifest. I mean, there's so many. And I stand ready to help the LCMS in any way I can.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for participating today. I'm sorry we weren't able to answer all of your questions, but if you would like to have follow-up on your questions, please email me at barb.bilo@lcms.org, or feel free to call us here at the International Center if you'd like to talk further about these issues. We invite you to join us again for our next Free to Be Faithful webinar that will be held on May 28th of this year, and will again start at 9 a.m. Central Time. So thanks, everyone, but thank you, Wesley Smith, and of course, Tim Gagline, for your valiant attempt at moderating today's session. Again, check us out and look at the archive of this webinar on www.lcms.org/free to be faithful. Everyone have a great day.